Hi, greetings, everyone. Van and Vivian here, as we are ready now to continue our study in Romans, Paul's epistle, Paul the apostle, his epistle to the Romans, and we have made our way to chapter 11. We're going to do a little bit of an overlap because there's quite a dramatic shift in focus now once we hit chapter 11 into the middle of chapter 11. So we have subtitled the entire study, "Among whom are ye also?" And just to remind all of us that Paul was a Jew. He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. And he was called. We know he was called. He was called on the Damascus Road. And Paul is saying to those in Rome, and he's specifically speaking now in these early verses of chapter 1, he's speaking to the Jews in Rome. He says to the Jews in Rome that they also were the called of Jesus Christ. Now, what's important here is that the Jew knew he was called of God. And when I say he was called of God, that would be Jehovah God. The Lord had singled out those of Israel. So the Jew knew their calling of Jehovah God. Now, Paul, what's new here is that Paul is telling them they are also now the called of Jesus Christ. Now, so far, and this is just a quick review of who it is that Paul has been addressing through these early chapters of Romans up to chapter 10, where he has spoken to, and here we hit 2:17, Romans 2:17, he says, "Thou art called a Jew." So those words, "thou art called a Jew," tell me right away that Paul's not specifically speaking to me, because I am not called a Jew. So I know now that Paul he has very specific things to say to the Jew, including what advantage hath the Jew? And he talks about Abraham, our father. This is not to be spiritualized. He's talking about those, his brethren he knows in the flesh. He talks about peace with God. He talks about, I speak to them that know the law. He speaks to those that know what is written in the scriptures. He presumes they know. When he says, "as it is written," he presumes that they know where those words are found. He speaks of those, "my kinsmen, according to the flesh," that's in Romans 9:3, who are Israelites. In fact, the entire context of chapter 9 has to do with Israelites, his kinsmen according to the flesh. Now, it's important for me to remember, because if I don't maintain awareness that chapter 9, 10, and so forth are dealing specifically with those of Israel until Paul says otherwise, then I'll get confused. He talks about his brethren who are of Israel. That's chapter 10, verse 1. Now, when we get to chapter 11, we're going to see a big shift. This is a huge shift in focus, where before he's been addressing directly the Jews. Now he's going to speak to Gentiles. And that starts in Romans 11, verse 13. So this is a significant shift in focus in terms of to whom Paul is addressing. So we'll start now. We are backing up just a little bit, especially for the sake of context and some other matters which will become clear as we move along.
Romans chapter 11, starting at verse 13. "For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead.
Okay, so let's move into now Romans 11, verse 13, where Paul begins with these words now, for I speak to you Gentiles. So before we saw he was speaking to the Jews, now he's speaking to the Gentiles. Now, question that I should ask is, who are the Gentiles addressed by Paul? Well, in the past, I've just assumed I understood who the Gentiles are, but I found myself corrected when I started paying attention to the context. So the context still has to do with Israel, Israel, who is the clay. We learned that in chapter 9. So chapters 9, 10, and 11 are very much focused on the matter of Israel, which Paul says is the clay. And it is they who were called. So Israel, so his brethren according to the flesh, that's chapter 9. And then Paul in verse 21 talks about the clay, and he says the same lump. So there is one lump of clay. It is the context of Israel. And of that clay, when we say that they were called, Paul makes it clear in chapter 9, verse 24 of Romans, that Jews were called, and note this, Gentiles were called, Gentiles of the clay, the same lump of Israel. So I go, wow, I don't think I ever recollected anyone sharing with me that someone from Israel could actually be called a Gentile.
Van,
Yes, Ken.
so this term used called, Jews were called, Gentiles were called. Is that, could that be, or is that a sort of a reference that actually is something like almost inherited and that comes all the way from Abraham?
Well,
Just
yeah,
the very nature of them being a Hebrew,
yeah.
or or I mean, does it really mean that they were individually called?
Yes and no, but I'm going to primarily, yes, they were individually called. They were called as a people, as a group, but they were also called individually. We know that because Paul was individually called. Timothy was individually called. Titus, they knew that they had been selected. So it's not a spiritual feeling, like I feel like I've been called to the ministry. Today, that's where things have morphed. They've morphed towards feelings. I feel I have been called to the mission field. So we're talking about here a material call. They are materially called of God, and they are called for specific purposes, including serving him.
At that time.
At that time.
They're not being called today.
Well, no, they're not, because the dispensation has changed, the gospel has changed, but they were called. So there were those, they were Jews, and the Jews are the religious circumcised of Israel. I mean, just add here, there is no such thing as an uncircumcised Jew. And the reason being that circumcision is part of being Jewish. It is their mark in the body that they are set aside, they are in the service of God. So Jews were circumcised, and that they were religious, and they are of Israel. Now there are also Gentiles, and the Gentiles were of Israel, but they were not religious. And they were uncircumcised. They had not maintained the covenant of circumcision in their body. But nonetheless, Paul says they're called. So we have both Jews and Gentiles called. So then when Paul says, for I speak to you Gentiles, now this is very different. And I'm not trying to tell you that this is the way to understand it, but I'm saying this is the way I read it. The text So if you see something, if you think I'm doing violence to the text, then you point it out. But otherwise, the way it reads is when Paul says, I speak to you Gentiles, he is speaking to the called of Israel who are not circumcised, and they are not religious, and they in fact are scattered in the world, including they were present in Rome. Now, I should add that I too am a Gentile, but Paul is speaking to those Gentiles who first are his kinsmen in the flesh. So the message that Paul has in getting it to me begins with getting it to Gentiles who first understood the scriptures, knew something about the scriptures, though they were not particularly religious. Now, Paul says, I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. Now he says he's the apostle of the Gentiles. Now that word of is a pretty important two-letter word. It's a preposition. That preposition of actually indicates relation or a relationship. So when Paul says, I am the apostle of the Gentiles, he's saying my apostleship is related to the Gentiles. That's very important for me to understand that, because later on, Paul is going to, he's now made this point about relationship, but he's going to say in Romans 15:16 that he is the apostle to the Gentiles. So we have Romans 15:16 to the Gentiles, Romans 11:13 of the Gentiles. So why is this important? Well, the preposition to is a preposition that indicates direction. So then Paul's direction was towards the Gentiles, but his relationship was with the Gentiles. Now, the importance of this, if you turn in your Bible to Galatians chapter 2, and there's a couple of verses here that should clear this up, but they're pervasively misunderstood and mistaught in the Christian world. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 7, when Paul is speaking to Peter and those with Peter, he speaks to them and he says, but contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the circumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. Now, the point being that in Christendom today, it is commonly taught there is only one gospel, and that gospel, that same gospel was given to Paul, and he went to the Gentiles with it. That same gospel was given to Peter, and Peter went to the circumcision with it. That's what's taught. So you can speak to somebody who's a dispensationalist, Acts chapter 2 dispensationalist, maybe they're even of the Brethren Church, or a good solid dispensationalist, but they will maintain that there is only one gospel of salvation, and Paul was to take it to the Gentiles, while Peter and the apostles were to take it to the circumcision. But that's not what is said in Galatians chapter 2, verse 7. Now, if I read this properly, understanding that the preposition of indicates relationship, then this is what I understand. So Galatians 2, verse 7, but contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel that was related to the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel related to the circumcision was to Peter, I go, oh, there are two different gospels here. There is one gospel that is related to the circumcision. There is another gospel which is related to the uncircumcision. That was the gospel. The one that was given to the uncircumcision was the one that was given to Paul. Now, when people study these verses, they ignore the fact that these prepositions are actually contain a huge amount of instruction in how to understand what's going on. So Paul has a gospel, and that gospel is to the Gentiles, and his relationship is with the Gentiles. So we'll move on from that. So now I know that there are two different gospels, one to the circumcision and one to the uncircumcision. Paul now is focused on the Gentiles here, and he says, I magnify my office. And then there's a colon. Now that colon is very important as well, because that colon tells me that the words that are going to follow in verse 14 explain what Paul has just said here about him being an apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. So let's see what is said in verse 14. He says, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them. So now I know, because of the colon, the them relates to the Gentiles, because this is an explanation of Paul saying, I am the apostle of the Gentiles. And he wants to provoke them to emulate him, to provoke Gentiles to emulate him, which are my flesh. Oh, so these are Gentiles, which are my flesh. Now we know that Paul was a Hebrew of the tribe of Benjamin. So he's talking about Gentiles, which are my flesh. I've never had this pointed out to me in the past. He says, Gentiles, which are my flesh, and might save some of them. My flesh. So that means, when I'm reading this now, Romans 11:14, the Gentiles Paul addresses here in this chapter 11, starting at verse 13, these are Gentiles, which are them, which are my flesh. So if you've ever had that pointed out to you, I've never had it pointed out to me. We're pointing it out here. So therefore, Paul is addressing Gentiles, which are of Israel. So that's a little bit of a surprise. Now,
So, excuse me?
yes.
But okay, so in verse 13, he's saying, for I speak to you Gentiles, and as much as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office. So it almost sounds though like he's talking to general Gentiles and making a point that he's also trying to provoke those other Gentiles who are of his flesh. Does that make sense?
So when you say those other Gentiles which are of his flesh?
No, so in verse 13 where he's saying, so for I speak to you Gentiles.
Yes.
And he's saying, as much as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office. If by any means I may
wait, don't go too fast. I magnify my office, colon.
Yeah, and then he says, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them. So it's like he's saying them. He's talking to is he referring to two different groups? Because them is he's talking about those Gentiles who are in the flesh. But the first Gentiles that he makes mention in verse 13, is it possible that those are Gentiles like us,
Of the nations.
Yeah, of the nations. So are they Gentiles of the nations? Well, that is the way it's taught. And so
Generally taught.
generally taught within Christendom, that's the way it's taught. But I'm not going to rest my case just on these few words. We'll continue through. You'll see more evidence why these Gentiles are the Gentiles, which are the uncircumcised of Israel. They are those which are of the same lineage, descendancy as Paul. And he's
Yes.
talking about,
Yes.
he wants to save some of them.
I realize that
So-
those are the uncircumcised Hebrews.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering about is the Gentiles that where he's saying, for I speak to you Gentiles. How could he be speaking to the Gentiles who are also of them, of his flesh? Am I making myself understandable? I don't know if I am, but
Yeah,
like
no, I
them-
know. Yeah,
okay, do you get what I'm saying?
yes.
Okay.
We have to go back the way Van presented it earlier. I think it takes a while to sink in.
Yeah.
It took me a while.
So Vivian and I had a lot of discussion about this, and it does take a while to sink in, but it is faithful to the way the language is being presented.
And consistent with what Paul has said all the way through in chapter 4.
Right.
And
if we remember that that in chapter 9 he's talking about Israel, my kinsman, according to the flesh, and he talks about the clay. There's only one lump of clay, and there are both Jews and Gentiles called out of that clay.
Yeah. In all fairness, too, those words, them which are italicized, so they weren't in the original, right? So if you take those out, then I could see that it could be the two Gentiles could be the same group, right?
Yeah. So
we'll
yes.
press on
So
because it's going to become clearer, I think.
Yeah. So
as we move through.
But your points, Liz, are well taken, because anybody who's not familiar hearing any of this is going to get choked when they hear this and say, that's not right. Paul is speaking to me. Well, I don't know about that, because Paul says, I want to emulate them to be like him. So let's push a little deeper into these verses. He talks about, I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh. So emulation, what Paul is saying is that Paul wants those that he is trying to provoke to either equal or surpass him in achievement as one who believes the gospel of Christ. He says, I want to provoke them, to those which are my flesh, to achieve at least as much, if not more, than what he's done. And there's that word provoke. My flesh. Now, my flesh is Romans 9:3b, my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, that he might save some of them. So Paul's objective concerning the Gentiles of Israel, and when I say Gentiles of Israel, we're talking about uncircumcised, those that are uncircumcised, and they're certainly uncircumcised of Israel. They were, even Moses had a son which was uncircumcised, and he had to get his son circumcised lest there be a death, to provoke to emulation his move. So Paul had moved. Where had he moved? He had moved to the gospel of Christ. Now, Paul believed in Jehovah God, but he did not believe the gospel of God. In fact, the gospel of God related to the church in Jerusalem. This was the gospel that Peter preached, that Jesus is the Christ. Now, the gospel of God is that the righteousness of God is revealed.
The gospel of Christ.
I'm sorry, the gospel, well, the gospel of Christ is revealed
The
in
righteousness
his,
revealed.
the righteousness is revealed in his death, burial, and resurrection. So through his death, burial, and resurrection, Paul says, righteousness, the righteousness is now revealed, that one can be made righteous without works simply by believing the work of Christ, his resurrection. So the Gentiles of the nations were to follow the Gentiles of Israel. So I come after the Gentiles of it. So Paul ministers to them first, and then they who are in the world, living in all kinds of Gentile of the nation cities, are saved, and then they, by their ministry, reach me. So Gentiles do include Israel, they do include me. Gentiles, them.
That's going to become clear in chapter 16, verses 24 and 25.
Yeah.
The obedience of the faith.
Yeah. Now, so Paul says in verse 15, so we're moving now to verse 15, for if the casting away of them, the Gentiles, so the context is still the Gentiles. I was never cast away. If the casting away of them, the Gentiles, be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Notice this, life from the dead. Now, when we were looking and comparing this to the parable of the prodigal son, the lost son, the conclusion regarding the younger son, when the father was talking to the elder brother, he made the comment in Luke 15:32, he said to the elder brother, the father says, it was meet, or that it's appropriate, it was meet that we should make merry and be glad. Remember that the elder son was complaining about the party that the father was throwing. And he said, for the younger son. And the father says, no, it was appropriate that we should be merry and be glad. Why? Because for this thy brother, the younger, was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. So what we take from this is that that those in Romans 15, but life from the dead, here in the parable, Luke 15:32, the father says, your brother was dead and is alive again. So notice this, Romans 11:15, life from the dead, your brother was dead and is alive again. So we're talking about Hebrews. That's another reason why I know these Gentiles are uncircumcised of Israel. These are the ones that were dead, but then through the gospel, they are made alive again. Colossians 2:13.
Colossians 2:13. And you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses.
Now, this is first to the uncircumcised of Israel, but it also extends to me. I too was dead in sin. My conscience tells me that I sin, but I have been quickened together with him, and all my sins, all my trespasses have been forgiven. So it starts with the Gentiles of Israel, and it extends to all of us who are Gentiles as well.
Can I make a point about verse 15? It says, for if the casting away of them, be the reconciling of the world. What had happened in Israel's history is that they had cast away from themselves the uncircumcised. They were dispersed in the world, and there was enmity between them. And so that is the casting away of them. They were considered dead.
That's true.
And
So
now, through Paul's gospel
Yeah.
only, they're being reconciled to God through Paul's gospel, and now they're alive again.
So there was great enmity between the circumcised and the uncircumcised. This is not God casting them away. It is, in fact, it is the division within the people of Israel.
And it had been going on for centuries.
Exactly.
Yeah, centuries.
There was great enmity. This enmity now is being assuaged. It's being addressed by the work of Christ.
And only in Paul's gospel could that have been the case, that they would be brought
Right.
into relationship again
Yeah.
with their brethren.
Under Jehovah God, there was no reconciliation. And certainly within the gospel of God, that Jesus is the Christ, they still had to do works to demonstrate that they believed. They couldn't do works to be made righteous, but they were to do works to show their righteousness.
Which is why Paul had such trouble everywhere he went, because he told these uncircumcised Hebrews that they didn't need to be circumcised.
Yeah.
And the Jews kept coming in and said, yes, they do. Yes, they do. Yes,
Yeah.
they do.
Paul said, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So the Jews who were circumcised took that as Paul saying, don't get circumcised. And they hated Paul for that, because they were trying to make themselves righteous by performing deeds of the law.
And boasting in the law.
And boasting, taking their confidence in what they had done to make themselves righteous. And Paul, through all these early chapters of Romans, is telling them you cannot be made righteous by the law. So life from the dead. This is another indication why we know that these Gentiles were Hebrews, uncircumcised of Israel. So now we read in verse 12, if the fall of them, Israel, by works, be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them, the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness. Now we'll look at the conclusion of the elder son. Now, in the parable of the prodigal, there was the younger son who went out and lived among the pigs and then came back. But the elder son stayed with the father. He did everything the father said to do. He never transgressed any of the commandments. He obeyed. He was faithful to the father.
Can I just point out,
Yeah.
we've moved back in the passage of
Yes.
Romans. We've moved back from
Yeah,
15 to 12.
We moved. We started at verse 13.
15.
Yes, but we actually began at
13.
verse 13.
Sorry.
We stepped back to verse 12 because I wanted to pick up this connection here with the elder son, where Paul was talking about Israel, the fall of Israel by works. And then what Paul is pointing out here is that there was a diminishing of them, their role, their responsibility diminished, but then, and that resulted in the riches of the Gentiles. Now, how much more their fullness, the fullness being now of Israel. So the parable, Luke 15:31, we read, and he, the father, said unto him, that is the elder brother, son, thou art ever with me. Myself. All right, so we had taken a step back to look at Romans 11:12, where Paul is speaking about the fall of them, that is Israel, by works. Israel did fall because of their focus on doing works to make themselves righteous. So Paul says, if the fall of them be the riches of the world and the diminishing of them, that is Israel by works, be the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness. So this is Israel's fullness. And this is the picture then of the elder son, where the father said to the elder son, "Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine." Now, this is true. All that I have is thine, because they are of the earth. Israel is of the earth. The body of Christ, the Gentiles, including those of Israel who are uncircumcised and believe the gospel, they are of the heavenly kingdom. So when the Father says, "All that I have is thine," on the earth, that's very true. So that is their fullness. Their fullness happens when they recover from their fall, and their fall was striving to attain righteousness by works. So when they get past that, they will then they'll come into their fullness. When will this happen? This will happen as it did for Paul and for Thomas and all the other apostles. When they see the wounds and they recognize who their Savior is, then they will be able to be made righteous by believing in him, just simply believing in him, as opposed to doing works of righteousness.
And that was looking forward to Israel corporately, but
Yes.
individually, they could still attain righteousness by believing Paul's gospel.
Yes. And it's true to this day now. During this day, during the dispensation of the grace of God, whether Jew, whether Gentile, whether of Israel, Hebrew, whether circumcised, uncircumcised, for all people of the world, it matters not. Everybody during this time is saved the same way, and that is through the work of Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection. His victory over the grave is the proof that he saves. Okay, we're going to move into verses 16 through 18.
Romans chapter 11, starting at verse 16. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee.
So what we see in verse 16, he talks about if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. So there's only one lump, that's Israel, that's the clay, but here is now being referred to as the tree. The first fruit is holy, that is set apart. The lump is also holy, set apart. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. Jeremiah 2:3 reads, Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruit of his increase. Now, when we see the word holiness, today we tend to think, well, that means sinless. The primary context here is this matter of being set apart. Israel was set apart unto the Lord, Jehovah God. So Israel was holiness, that's being set apart. The first fruits be holy. So Israel being set apart unto the Lord continues. The first fruits.
Who's the first fruit?
The first fruit are, well, actually the first fruits would be Christ and
Right.
those that came who followed him, his disciples, and those that followed in the church of God. They would have been
set apart.
They were set apart. They were
unto the Lord.
Yeah.
So who's the lump then?
So
Is
the
that
lump,
Israel?
The lump is Israel. It actually begins with Christ, but we understand it to be with Abraham. So Abraham was set apart, and then all his descendants were set apart, except with the exception of Ishmael, who was of the flesh. So the first fruit be holy, that is, the whole thing began set apart, and it continued to be set apart. So this is the point that Paul is making. He says the first fruits of his increase, the lump is also holy, that is set apart. So Israel's increase, that is the lump, is set apart. Now, the argument here is to the Gentiles who are trying to who Paul anticipates making an argument that Israel, circumcised Israel, is not special anymore. And Paul is going to say, no, they are still special. He says, if the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, the branches would be all those of Israel circumcised that believed the gospel of God. Isaiah 11:10.
Isaiah 11:10. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious.
Okay, so a root of Jesse, and we know that Jesse was the father of David, and that in fact the circumcised are those to whom the Gentiles will seek. So here we have the two different groups within Israel, the circumcised and the uncircumcised. Romans 15:12.
Romans 15:12. And again, Isaiah saith, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, in him shall the Gentiles trust.
Okay, so this is all within Israel. There shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. So this is not David reigning over me. This is David reigning over the Gentiles of Israel. And the Gentiles of Israel will trust. They will accept that reign because it is all part of their lineage.
So excuse me, Matt,
Yes.
is the root referring back to the first fruit?
The
'Cause it's
root,
saying-
the
The
so
root, because it's saying, so
It's setting apart of Abraham.
Yeah.
The root, isn't it?
So the root is the beginning of it all. So that is that's the setting out of Abraham, because he was called
Isaac and Jacob.
Isaac, Jacob, Joseph,
And all the 12.
and
tribes.
the 12 tribes.
Okay.
So then the root is holy. That root is holy. Now these branches are the descendancy from the root, from Abraham, Isaac,
what it's
Jacob,
saying.
Joseph. Then we go on to the branches, and the branches are holy. They are set apart. So Israel was holiness. Israel was set apart unto Jehovah God, and the first fruits of his increase were set apart. So all Israel was holiness. That is, all Israel is set apart unto the Lord. Now there's an issue. And the issue is, what about Genesis 17:14? Genesis 17:14 says,
Genesis 17:14. And the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people.
so the point I'm trying to make here is, Israel is set apart to the Lord. But then we see that there are both Gentiles as well as the circumcised of Israel. So in Genesis 17:14, we have this, if you're not circumcised, you're cut off. So does that mean that they're not set apart? Well, let me point this out. It says that they're cut off from his people. So the uncircumcised man-child of Israel was cut off from his people. He was not cut off from Jehovah God. It doesn't say you're cut off from God. It says you're cut off from the people. Therefore, both the circumcised and the uncircumcised are still holiness to the Lord. There's nobody here being cut off. The gifts and calling of God are without repentance. This is a matter between the people on the earth. So very important, this being cut off, the Gentiles that were cut off of Israel are not cut off from God. They're just cut off from other of the circumcised. And that's where the enmity stemmed. Now, 17a, if some of the branches be broken off. So notice it's some, broken, that is separated forcibly into parts, fragments, pieces, broken. Now, broken can include that which can be healed, right? If some of the branches are broken off, notice they're broken off, they can be healed. Luke 4:18.
Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted.
So the thought here is that it's specifically saying, Paul says, broken off, because something can be repaired, it can be healed, and there's a condition. So the branches that are broken off, these are Israel, circumcised branches are broken off. There is a condition under which they can be grafted in again. Now we're not going to see that condition until we get to verse 23. We're only on verse 17. We've got a ways to go before we'll see the condition under which the branches that were broken off can be reattached. Now, so if some of the
Van, sorry.
Yes, Ken. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
In being broken off, it's because they would not accept the Messiah. They would not see and receive the Messiah. And that's what caused the breaking off?
Yes, it was, they were seeking their righteousness by works.
Right.
And that was the reason that they were broken off, because they didn't attain what they were seeking for, because they sought it by works and not by faith. That is, by believing God.
So it's not
Yeah.
So their Messiah came and they rejected him.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's not referring to the uncircumcised ones. It's referring to the Jews who were
Yes.
religious.
Yes.
That makes sense. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. So the uncircumcised now, at this point, there's nothing for them. Paul hasn't come along yet. So they're just scattered, and they're in the world and they're dead. Just like the father of the prodigal son, that son was dead. So something's going to happen to the uncircumcised, where they can be brought back from death. However, these branches that are broken off, they're not dead. They're broken off, but they can be grafted back in. Now, Paul says, thou, that is the Gentiles, being a wild olive tree. I might point out, I'm not part of a wild olive tree. The olive tree points to Israel. thou being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So grafted, just to make sure we all are on the same page, that's, we say today grafted or graft. So that's to insert a twig or a stalk into a tree. You can graft a branch in. So Paul is saying that the wild olive tree, which is an olive tree that is growing in a state of nature, that it's not a cultivated tree. It is an olive tree, but it is not cultivated. So these that are being grafted in are of a wild olive tree.
A related tree.
It's still an olive tree.
Same genus of root.
And so we make the point, the olive tree speaks of Israel. So thou being a wild olive tree, that's wild Israel.
I have another question. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead, Ken.
Okay, olive trees in nature, and maybe Liz can answer this because she's got olive trees.
I do.
Do they ever, like, in their root mass, will a tree, a stalk share the same root as the one next to it? Or is it totally separate?
Yeah, I don't know,
Separate.
but
Like a laurel bush, well,
Yeah, no, an olive tree can't do that.
no?
yeah, I think the olive tree is more like other fruit trees, like a cherry or a plum. I know that I've got a fig tree, and it actually will send up other trees from the same root.
Yeah, those are shoots. Those
Yeah,
are
shoot.
shoots.
Yeah,
They could become a tree.
but I don't know that the olive tree does that. Okay, so now we're talking about an olive tree.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah,
The purpose of a grafting is to help the original tree bear more fruit.
yes. Oh, yes.
Mhm. Go on.
All right. So then verse 18, if some of the branches are broken off, now I noticed not all of the branches of Israel were broken off, and thou were grafted in among them. So this is the wild branches being grafted in among the cultured branches. So that would be the Gentiles now are grafted in among the circumcision, and with them partakest of the root. So the root then goes all the way back to Abraham. So now both these branches are partaking in the root
Of their common ancestry.
of their common ancestry, boast not against the branches. So you're not being preferred just because he's telling the Gentiles, you're not preferred just because you're grafted in. He says, boast not against the branches. So this is a warning to the Gentiles of Israel not to boast. And there was boasting. They thought they were being preferred. So the circumcision made their boast of keeping the law. In 2:17, Romans 2:17.
Romans 2:17 says, behold, thou art called a Jew and restest in the law and makest thy boast of God.
So there's some boasting going on. The Jew, the circumcised, is boasting in their keeping of the law. Remember, the prodigal son, the elder brother, how did he boast? His boast was that he kept all the commandments. He did exactly what the father wanted to do. The younger son, his boast was he's brought back in, and he thinks he's being preferred because he's being brought back in and a party's being thrown for him.
That's just so amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Okay, so he says, boast not against the branches, the natural branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So you're being sustained by the root. Now, so the Jew made a boast of their keeping of the commandments. The elder son of the parable of the lost son is an example of such a boast. This is what the elder son said, Luke 15:29.
Luke 15:29. And he, that is the elder son, and he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment.
We see the perfect picture here of what the Jew is making his boast of God. I serve you and I keep your commandments. What more do you want? So the Gentiles boasted against the Jews, the branches that were broken off. Now, the branches that were broken off because while they were keeping the commandments and serving, they actually did not believe. They did not believe God.
Romans chapter 11, verse 19 and forward. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off.
Okay, all right. So let's move now, verse 19, Romans chapter 11, verse 19. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. So the Gentiles' thinking is incorrect. This is what they're thinking. Paul anticipates that they are thinking the reason the branches were broken off was for the purpose of their being grafted in. And Paul says, no, that's not true. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 18.
Hebrews chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief.
So this is the problem. Paul says in verse 22, he says, well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And thou standest by faith, be not high-minded, but fear. So the branches that were broken off, even though they were serving and keeping the commandments, they were broken off because they actually did not believe. They did not believe God. Now he warns the Gentiles, don't be high-minded. Now that word high-minded is having a haughty, proud, or arrogant spirit. He says, don't get caught up in yourself.
And are they standing in their high-mindedness because they claim they stand by faith? Is that what is doing it?
No, actually it's because the branches were broken off. So they say the branches were broken off. This is actually a picture of replacement theology. Replacement theology says, well, Israel rejected their Messiah, therefore we are now the people of God. And they actually boast against the circumcision.
So why is he commenting, thou standest by faith? What is that referring to?
So faith means thou standest by believing by God. So there are you are standing by faith. It's not a warning, but it is a statement of fact.
By the work of God.
It sounds like he's making a contrast here. Because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith.
By the faith of Christ.
Be not high-minded. About what?
About the fact that they were grafted in.
Yeah. They're comparing themselves. They're saying, oh, we are better because we have been grafted in.
Yeah,
okay, I know, but what does that mean, standest by faith? Why did he put that in?
Maybe by the faith of Christ. And
faith in what?
They're believing the gospel of God. They're believing the prophets.
Yeah, there's no but here. It is a statement of fact. He says, unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. So it's
Faith and
not
unbelief are the
it's not a
same.
but you're standing by faith, or that somehow your standing is more tenuous. One's standing is not tenuous because it's by faith. It is a statement of fact. And Paul says now, we have to continue. He says, be not high-minded, but fear. Notice there's a colon. So we'll get our explanation following the colon. Be not high-minded, don't get puffed up, but fear. So let's look forward. Unbelief is the problem, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. So there is a matter here that Paul is warning the grafted in branches. Take heed lest he also spare not thee. Now, take heed is listen up, Paul says to them. So Paul corrects the Gentile understanding, and he says, therefore, the goodness of God, goodness, which is a manifestation of benevolence. That is, this is what we understand to be grace, goodness, and grace. God was goodness towards the Gentiles. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love, wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, hath he quickened us together with Christ. By grace are ye saved. There's the benevolence. And then there's severity of God. Now, severity is on them which fell, severity. Severity is strictness, sternness in dealings. So under the law, God was strict. So those that were going to persist in serving God by the law and trying to find their righteousness by the law had very strict dealings.
Leviticus 26, verse 14. But if ye will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commandments, and we skip to verse 16, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning ague that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart.
Okay, and that word ague, by the way, that's an acute fever, a violent fever. That's what ague is. So God says, to those that are under the law, if ye will not hearken unto me, then I will do this to you. That's the kind of dealings God has with those under law. Sternness in dealings. Now we are getting to a point here about the goodness and the Gentiles, and where he says, fear, behold the goodness of God, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou shalt also be cut off. Notice the word is not broken off, it is actually now cut off. So they have to continue in his goodness, otherwise they shall be cut off. So these are branches of Gentile believers that can be cut off. So what's this about? Well, cut off is an interruption or a stopping. Notice this, 2 Timothy 4.
2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. Of whom be thou ware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words.
Alexander the coppersmith is an example of a Gentile, an uncircumcised, who believed the gospel of grace, but then did evil to Paul. So Paul shows here in his words that Alexander the coppersmith is not going to lose his salvation, but what he's going to lose is his reward. This is actually Paul further elaborates about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 about rewards based on how they serve in the body of Christ. Alexander the coppersmith did evil. He was a believer, yet he did evil, and his reward is going to be according to his works within the body of Christ. This is unique to those Hebrews, whether circumcised or uncircumcised. They were to serve, they were to do the work of God. And this is what the judgment seat standing before Christ is all about. They are to receive reward or loss of reward for their work as they followed instruction.
That was the work they were called to do.
Yeah. So the Gentiles are being warned not to boast, but you have to continue. Paul says you have to continue in his goodness. And that included obeying everything that Paul said that they were to do. Otherwise, they could experience being cut off.
Now,
Again.
Van, when you say cut off, does that mean cut off from the people, cut off from his goodness?
Cut off from reward.
Reward, okay.
Yeah.
As seen in 2 Timothy in the example of Alexander the coppersmith.
Yeah. So it's not loss of salvation. It's not being broken off. It is being cut off. That is, they're actually now no longer in service.
And they're not.
I think it would be safe to say that most of Christendom takes this whole section about the tree and the branches and being grafted in and cut off and all of it, and they take that as belonging to the so-called Gentile, the non-Hebrew people of the world, the believers.
Yes.
And try to make it work, in regards to grace by faith and not of works.
Yes.
And especially those who believe that you can lose your salvation. That's kind of like their proof text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, I think, if we could really, maybe next time, if we could spend a little more time on this section just to go through it.
Yeah, we're actually only halfway through to the end of chapter 11.
Did you think you'd finish today, Van?
Yeah, I know.
We thought we might finish 11.
But yeah, no, yeah, they try to make this matter of being cut off, loss of salvation, you
Exactly.
name it. But in fact, this was what's going on here is limited to the time of Paul and those that were called under service to him. He was their commissioned officer, their apostle, and they were to obey him. And if they didn't obey him, then there was going to be loss of reward. So we'll end the study here. We'll pick up next time at verse 23, and hopefully we'll get to the end of chapter 11 next time. Okay.